Another question, could you go into more detail about what you mean by, quote, being ferocious about boundaries, unquote, under Socratic coaching?
Sure.
We didn't talk about boundaries. That's an important
Yeah.
concept.
We didn't talk that much about boundaries in this presentation, but it's something that's very important. We believe that all employees on a virtual team need to know exactly what they can do and what they can't do as far as things like which decisions can I make independently or which decisions do I need to run through my manager, because they're independent. They can't wait for everything, or they can't wait for the manager for all of those decisions. But if there are decisions that need to be run through management, they need to know that. Can I spend money? Can I not spend money? Can I change the scope of a project? Can I not change the scope of the project? It's very important that the leader be clear about those kinds of expectations and boundaries up front. And then if you waffle on the boundaries, if you say, well, maybe you can spend more money than I said, it sends a double message to people that's very confusing to them. So when we interviewed people and asked them for tips, they said, if it's a real boundary, it's a real boundary, and you need to be pretty strong about that. Ferocious, that doesn't mean you have to be a jerk. You know, you can be nice about it. You say, no, you know, if it's more than $500, we do have to get authorization from accounting or from finance. Don't waffle on a boundary. Right. If you find yourself, one tip, if you find yourself needing to be more flexible, you might ask yourself the question, is this a true boundary? Or is this just something that I'm putting in place to make myself comfortable as the manager of the team? Because if it's a boundary, you shouldn't change it, at least not very often. I mean, there are situations where you would say, okay, this is what the customer wants today, and then the customer changes their mind, so you have to go back in. It initially was a boundary, but you have to go back in and say, hey, it's changed. Yep. You know, they want it this way instead of that way, and so we've got to change that boundary. We've got to modify that boundary. But those should not be common.
Okay. Are there any warning signs that a manager or a manager's manager of a virtual manager should be looking out for that are early indicators that things aren't going to go well with this virtual team or the virtual employees on the team? At both the macro and the micro at each individual level, what are the warning signs that are early indicators that performance may lag?
There are definitely early indicators. We share one of those, an example of that in the book about an individual who was working in a consulting firm. And so everybody was on the road all the time except for a couple of people doing the admin work in the office. And what was unknown to the leader, who was also on the road, was that this individual was doing very inappropriate things in terms of their interaction with the other people in the office, but the people in the office were uncomfortable bringing that up. And there were some warning signs, things where the people in the office would go in a different area when the person was in the office, but nobody really noticed that. Customers even were starting to go around this individual to get work done, and then it became very obvious when they began complaining about the person. So you need to watch for those little kinds of things. Are people trying to avoid this person? Is this person not getting included in conversations? Are people intentionally trying to ignore them? And keep up on that so that you can see if that's happening. What others would you add?
I would say, you know, in the book we talk about how we believe that all problems are magnified at a distance. And it's true. What may seem like a little problem is probably a big problem. So we are in favor of early intervention. If as a manager or a manager's manager, you just start to see things that don't seem right, deadlines are slipping a little bit, there's a reluctance for the team to communicate with each other. They are uncomfortable confronting people directly when there's a problem. They start to talk behind their backs to other people. When you see those things that in a co-located organization, you might think, well, that's not that big of a deal. In a distance relationship, it can be a very big deal. So if you see erosion of trust kinds of issues, if you see lack of willingness to share information or to confront issues, if you see any of the business indicators slacking, it's time to jump in and at least have the conversation. How's it going? How's it going, guys? Get it on the table and begin the discussion, because it usually means that something needs to be done. And you can wait too long. and it's much more difficult. We talked about building trust. That takes a long time. Destroying trust doesn't.
Right.
You can destroy trust instantaneously, and you want to avoid that.
What's your position on the worst case where you have to let someone go who's a virtual employee? Are you a big proponent of you should do that face-to-face, or is it acceptable just given the frequency in which virtual employees are operating these days to virtually fire someone?
Well, we think that there's a few things that need to be done face-to-face, and letting someone go would be one of those.
Okay.
Hopefully, you have given them good feedback face-to-face prior to that, so that it's not a surprise. Conflict resolution, good performance feedback, dealing with situations where there's likely to be a emotional component, which makes the conversation more complex. Those things really should be done face-to-face. We tell the story in the book of an engineer that came to us one time and said, "I just got my performance review." And we said, "Well, how'd that go?" And he said, "Not so good. I got it over email." And he didn't feel very good about getting his feedback that way. And he said, you know what makes it worse is that my boss is in my same office.
Wow.
The boss was actually co-located, but they were so used to doing things over the technology, that was just the normal way to communicate, that I don't think the boss really stepped back and thought about what's the best way to deliver this information, and it wasn't the way he selected.
He wasn't just in the same office, he was 2 cubicles down.
Oh, wow.
It was really,
Oh, wow.
really
We
not
have
good.
about 3 minutes left. Let me ask this final question. You've provided so many tips and tools and advice for virtual managers. They're very busy, as all of us are. If you were to do a short list of these are the must-dos that a virtual manager has to do in order to lead a successful virtual team, what would you advise them to focus on their short list?
I think what I would advise is the startup things such as a charter, definition of roles and responsibilities, and operating guidelines and electronic protocols, those kinds of things to get the team off, understanding how they're going to interact together.
I agree. And I think the performance management routine is really critical. How often are you going to meet, and is it going to be teleconference or web conference? How often are you going to have the face-to-face? Having a regular team meeting, regular one-on-ones, and regular face-to-face activities is really important. We still don't know how to substitute completely for face-to-face interaction. All the research indicates that there is a minimum amount of face-to-face activity that's required for you to have a successful team.
And it sounds also, to your point earlier, Kimball, that it's important to have a vision that is the rallying common ground that and it's built off the
Absolutely.
charter, but
Yes.
to keep reminding people this is why we exist as a virtual team, and also to engage them in the problem solving,
Yes.
and not just, that's great. Thank you so much for
Thank
your
you, Rich.
advice
It's been a
on this
pleasure.
critical topic that I'm sure is only going to expand as more and more companies utilize virtual teams.
Great.
So thank you for
Our
that.
pleasure.
Thank you, Rich.